All right, so let's begin today's lecture on chapter 11, which is from the book of Economic Management and Emerging Issues in Pakistan Economy. This is not persistent, it's the book name is just Economic Management and Emerging Issues. It is written by Professor Dr. Muhammad Islam Chaudhry, and I, Dr. Ariba Aslam, has contributed, a few chapters in this book. Today we will be discussing an important topic, which is about the public debt, the dependency, sustainability, and impacts on the economy. Now, before I begin, discussing this chapter basically examines, as you have just seen, the issue of public debt, the causes of public debt. It also discusses, how the debt has become unsustainable in nature, and obviously how it can be brought into back into the sustainability conditions, and particularly the impact of public debt on economic growth. So this is one of the most urgent and practically important topics in Pakistan's economic management today as well. Because Pakistan's public debt has grown to alarming levels. The total public debt, the domestic plus the external debt has approached, and in recent periods, it has exceeded over 80% of GDP. So debt servicing consumes, a very large share of the government's revenue, which leave, the little space for productive public expenditures. So understanding, the mechanics of debt accumulation, the conditions under which, debt become unsustainable, and the options for debt management is very essential, or they provide very essential knowledge, for anyone who is associated with the subject of economics, who may, called upon to advise on economic policy in Pakistan or somewhere. Before I move forward, I would like you to probe out that how many of you can estimate that what percentage of Pakistan's annual government revenues goes to paying the interest on the existing debt, the actual figure, and you will be surprised to see that it has reached 40% or more in some years. So typically, this is very surprising, even, for many of the economic students, and it sets the stage for understanding the severity of the debt challenge that we are going to discuss today. Um, this chapter basically covers the theoretical framework for understanding the public debt sustainability, Pakistan's debt experience in regional context, the fiscal deficit and the debt dynamics, and the drivers of, you can say, the debt accumulation, debt measurement, and its effect on employment and growth. Particularly the management of public debt, which includes, debt restructuring options as well. So the analytical framework basically of this chapter draws on debt sustainability analysis, also called as DSA methodology, which is developed by the IMF and the World Bank. And it is the standard approach used by the international institutions and government economists to assess whether a country's debt trajectory is sustainable in nature or not. This chapter also examines, the case studies of debt crisis and the resolutions in the other countries such as Argentina, Greece, Sri Lanka to draw lessons for Pakistan's own debt management challenge. So, debt theory and regional context. Um, Public debt is basically not bad inherently, and governments basically borrow to finance investment uh, that generates future growth, infrastructure, education, and health. So Sorry, I just lost my slide. Let me come back to it. Uh, yes. So I was telling you that, the public debt is basically not bad inherently. And the real problem is that how you manage it. And here comes, different policies as well. Because governments borrow to finance, their investment options that can, generate future growth, such as, for, as I already discussed, health, education, or infrastructure. So that will ultimately generate higher tax revenues to repay the debt. And this is, the public investment rationale for borrowing as well. And debt becomes problematic basically when it is used to finance the current consumption rather than productive investment. When the interest rates on a borrowed fund exceeds the rate of returns on the investment financed, or when the debt accumulates to a level, when the debt service burden crowds out the other public spendings and undermines the fiscal sustainability, then it becomes problematic in nature. So Pakistan's debt profile has several, concerning features such as, a significant share of debt is external and it is denominated in foreign currency, which basically creates exchange rate risk. And when the rupee basically depreciates, the rupee cost of debt service rises automatically. Interest rates on domestic debt have been high in nature, thus reflecting inflation and fiscal risk premiums. And much of the debt has been used to finance the current expenditures rather than the productive investment. So, in regional context, Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio is significantly higher than Bangladesh and India. And countries that have struggled with debt basically have managed, better fiscal discipline over the recent decades. Sri Lanka's recent debt crisis, which led to an catastrophic economic collapse in 2022, is basically a cautionary tale of what happens when debt sustainability is ignored. I would also like you to look into the difference between solvency and the liquidity in the context of sovereign debt. A country can be technically solvent. Solvent means in economics, uh, when assets exceed liability in the long run, um, but face a liquidity constraints or liquidity crisis. So, liquidity crisis is when you are unable to service the near-term debt obligation. So, a country can be technically solvent but face a liquidity crisis. Now, Pakistan has periodically faced near liquidity crisis, and then the questions come that what are the management tools available, in such and such case. Um, I'd like to talk about fiscal deficit, public debt, and growth for now because the standard debt dynamics education equation shows that the change in the debt to GDP ratio depends upon three main factors. One is the primary fiscal deficit, the other one is the interest rate on the existing debt, and the last one is the growth rate of GDP. Now, let's discuss the fiscal deficit, or you call it primary fiscal deficits. It is when your revenues, from the revenues, you minus the non interest expenditure. So you get the primary fiscal deficit. Let me repeat it again for you. Primary fiscal deficit is when your revenues minus the non interest expenditure. So your debt basically, debt to GDP ratio changes basically because of these three factors: the primary fiscal deficit, the interest rate on the existing debt, and the growth rate of GDP. So when the interest rate exceeds the growth rate, okay, and the primary deficit is large enough in nature, debt to GDP ratios would rise, inexorably. So Pakistan's chronic fiscal deficit has been the primary driver of the domestic debt accumulation. The low growth rates of recent years, below 3% for much of, 2018 and 2022 period, combined with the interest rates well above the level, have meant that debt dynamics have been fundamentally unfavorable in nature. So debt sustainability analysis involves, projecting these variables forward under different scenarios. If current trend continues, the modest growth, the high interest rates, and the persistent primary deficit, then the debt to GDP ratio will continue to rise. And only a combination of fiscal consolidation, and growth acceleration can stabilize the debt dynamics. Now, let me elaborate a little bit more for you that what do I mean when I said fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation is when you are reducing the primary deficit through revenue increases and expenditures cut. Okay. So the IMF's extended funding facility, which is also called as EFF, Extended Fund Facility, from IMF programs with Pakistan have been designed precisely around the debt sustainability framework, which requires the fiscal adjustment to reduce the primary deficit while providing the bridge financing to manage the near-term liquidity needs. Uh, you must take a break over here, and you may Google some of the questions such as what primary surplus would be needed to stabilize debt, particularly at the current level, given the current interest rate and growth. So this may connect you to the abstract theory, to the concrete, policy questions. So, so there are different scenarios. There's debt management itself is more complex than it appears. So it is basically more complex than it appears because total public debt includes the direct government debt, which includes the treasury bills, bonds, and borrowing from the state bank. The contingent liabilities, the contingent liabilities includes the guarantees for public enterprise borrowing, the pension obligation, and the potential bank bailout cost, and external debt which is owed by the private sector that may become, public in a crisis. When all contingent liabilities are included, Pakistan's true fiscal exposure is substantially larger than the headline debt figures suggest. And this is the main point that this is important for sustainability analysis. The headline debt to GDP ratio may look manageable, but the total fiscal risk is much larger. So the employment effect of high public debt works through multiple channels. High debt service, high debt service crowds out, the public investment in education, health, and infrastructure, which can, reduce the productive capacity of the economy, and that can limit the job creation. Similarly, high domestic borrowing raises the interest rate for private sector borrowers, which can crowd out the private investment and employment. Debt management, which is the strategy for managing the composition, maturity, and the cost of public debt, is also an important tool, which we will be discussing in a while. Just give me a 2 minutes break. Since the battery is low, so let me put the charger. So thank you for your patience. I was talking about the uh, debt management strategies. So debt management strategies are important, for managing the composition, the maturity, and the cost of, the public debt. Because all of these important things that I have discussed with you are very important. And they give you that important tools. For example, moving from short-term to long-term debt reduces the rollover risk. Similarly, moving from external to domestic debt would reduce the exchange rate risk. And though it may, increase the interest cost, but it will actually, the domestic debt may reduce the exchange rate risk. So, developing the domestic bond markets will deepen the financial markets and it will reduce the dependency on bank financing. So the ultimate solution to the debt problem is not the debt restructuring or forgiveness, though these may be necessary in an acute crisis, but the fiscal reform includes, the expanding revenues, improving expenditure quality, and, achieving the sustainable economic growth. And this all requires the political will to reform the institutions and power structures that have created the debt problems in the first place. So, as economists, our role is to make this case very clear and persistent. Now, you may calculate the Pakistan's debt trajectory under, the three scenarios. These three scenarios could be the baseline, the optimistic, and the pessimistic, and present your findings, with the policy recommendation. So this will be an excellent preparation for the for your thesis, for your next research paper as well. Um, when you talk about the future scenarios and the debt management strategies, debt sustainability scenarios, under different assumptions about growth, primary balance, and industrial to be a wide range of, possible trajectories or possible way outs in which you can see that whether Pakistan's debt is sustainable in nature or not. Unfortunately, apart from few years, our debt has been unsustainable in nature from 50 years or more. So, from gradual debt reduction under some optimistic assumption will help to escalate the debt under the adverse scenarios. The most pessimistic scenario, which combines the low growth, the large deficit, and the rising interest rates, such as that in the IMF program or IMF periods, project that Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio will continue to rise towards the unsustainable levels without structural reform. So Pakistan's debt management strategy must prioritize, lengthening the maturity of the domestic debt, diversifying the creditors base, and increasing the concessional borrowings, because that will actually develop, the domestic capital markets and reduce the fiscal deficit through structural revenue enhancement. So debt restructuring, as undertaken in 1999 Paris Club Agreement, has provided temporary relief to Pakistan, but does not address the underlying fiscal problem that generates, the new debt. Which basically, suggests that why we are caught in the debt trap and why, despite of several efforts over the years, that we have been, into the debt trap. So, breaking the debt trap, we actually may learn from our international experiences from Argentina, Greece, and Sri Lanka, which basically show that severe economic and social consequences of debt sustainability crisis, of the years of austerity, economic contractions, and human suffering. So we can learn from these countries and we can, have our own long-term political commitment to fiscal discipline that can, transcend the electoral cycles, which is a commitment that has historically been difficult for Pakistan to sustain, and is, one of the reasons why we are not able to have our any, 5-year policy implemented. So this ends our chapter on public debt. Now, this provides a very basic understanding of the issue of public debt. For more details and more analysis and more empirical analysis, you need to read the chapter of this book, which is chapter 11. Thank you.